Gunnlød merum gav, gullnom stoli å, dryckens dyra mjadar. Ill idgjöld let eg hana efter hafa, sinns ins heila hugar.
Hello and welcome back to this reading project. I'm reading from my book, The Seed of Yggdrasill. And today we have reached chapter 7, actually chapter 7.3, The Kiss of Death. So I'm just going to start reading. Just a moment. Yeah. Chapter 7.3, The Kiss of Death. And here is a quote from the Lokasenna, stanza 30. Loki kvad, fegi du, Freja, vik kan ek fullgerva, era der vamma vant, Åsa och Alfa här inni ero, värr hefre din hor verit. Loki said, "Be quiet, Freya. I know you thoroughly. You are not in lack of shame. Of all the Aesir and all the elves that are seated here in this hall of immortals, each one has been your lover." So, both from the Edda and from the Skaldic and from the saga literature, there are examples of death presented poetically as a sexual encounter between the dead or the dying and a female power associated with death, such as Hel, Ron, or Freya, or a Valkyria, for example, or a daughter of Ran. The death experience could be described in poetry as the act of climbing into Ran's bed, or as being embraced by the death woman. In the poem Ynglingatal, composed by the skald Tjodolfr Urhvini during the late 9th century, that would be the 800s, the combination of sex and death is repeated over and over. In that poem, the poet describes the death of various Ynglinga kings, and their deaths are described as a sexual encounter between the king and Hel, the queen of the dead. I recite from Ynglingatal, stanza 7. Och Alvald Yngva tjodar, Loka mär of leikin hefer. Loka mär, that is Loki's maiden, and that is a known poetical metaphor for Hel. She is Loki's maiden, as in probably as in his daughter, because that's what, at least that's how Snorri explained this poetical metaphor. When Hel is referred to as Loka mär, Loki's maiden, he explains that's because she is his daughter. And the poem goes, and the ruler, Alvald, the all-ruler, of the people of Yng, Loki's maiden, as in Hel, has taken him as a lover. And that means that that he's dead. The ruler of the people of Yng dies. That's what this means. Because Loki's maiden has taken him as a lover. That is a poetical metaphor for dying. In another written version of the same poem, the Ynglingatal, the stanza translates, I do not deny that the goddess of Glitnir is taking lustful pleasure in the corpse of Dygvi. I read it in Norse. Kvedkat dol, nema Dygva hror, Glitnis gnø at gamni hefer. So this means that Glitnis gnø, that is the goddess of Glitnir, that is actually a poetical metaphor for Hel, for death. She is the goddess, the gnø of Glitnir. And Glitnir is a place, a sort of afterlife place, an after Ragnarok place. So this is interesting. So and the goddess of Glitnir, as in Hel, is now taking lustful pleasure in the corpse of Dygvi. And this means this is a poetical metaphor saying that Dygvi dies. Hel is taking lustful pleasure in his corpse. That means that he died. That Hel is known as the goddess of Glitnir, Glitnis Gno, in such an ancient source, because this is a very old source. Well, this speaks volumes about how she was conceived during the pagan Viking Age. You see, the Ynglingatal is a skaldic poem that was composed in the present form as we know it today, back in the late 800s, and that is deep pagan era time. So this is a very old literary source. It was written down a lot, many hundreds of years later, but the reason we know that it was composed in a bound form, using alliteration and a lot of systems that made it impossible to change it. So it was most likely transmitted exactly in the form that it was first composed. So this is a poem going older than the Edda poems that we know about. We will be discussing the place Glitnir further in the next section, but for now it is sufficient to say that Glitnir means the glittering, a bright, shining place where the gods will dwell after Ragnarök, and there they will dwell with people who are free from deceit. And the name used for goddess here is Gno, a goddess associated with divine messages sent rapidly through the air. Snorri claimed that Gno was Frigg's messenger, and that she has also been called the goddess of completion. And it is this kind of energy. So when Hel is referred to as Gno, because I've talked about this before, but in Old Norse poetry, any name of any goddess or female character can be used to describe another female character. So here, the name Gno for a goddess of messages, rapid messaging, this goddess is used to describe Hel, the goddess of death. So she is the goddess of the message of the place, of the glittering place where the gods are going to dwell after Ragnarok. So this says something, that this is the poet trying to say something about Hel by using the name of another goddess and by associating her to a place called Glitnir, which we know is an afterlife and after Ragnarok realm, a sort of heaven, and she is its messenger. So it is this kind of energy, Hel being the messenger of the place called Glitnir. Well, this kind of energy is taking such lustful pleasure in the corpse of the king. In stanza 32 of the Ynglinga saga, we read that Hel has invited the king to parliament, to thing. It was an established and well-known metaphor in Old Norse poetry to describe lovemaking through the metaphor of a female inviting a male to parliament, as in a council court. I read from stanza 32 of the Ynglingatal, this very old source. Och till things and to the parliament, Thridja Jöfri, for the third time, Vedrungsmær, or heimi baud, thos halfdaner, Norna doms of notit hafti. Sorry, och till things, and to parliament, that is a metaphor here for lovemaking, Thridja Jöfri, for the third time, Vedrungsmær, Vedrungsmaiden, that is Loki. Vedrung is a Haiti for Loki. So again, Hel is referred to as Loki's Vedrungsmaiden. So for the third time, Hel, Loki's maiden, invited him away from the world of the living. She invited him to parliament, that is to lovemaking, for the third time, and away from the world of the living. Thus, Halfdan, the king here, could have pleasure in Nornadoms, the judgment of the Norns. And the judgment of the Norns is a metaphor for death. Or the verdict, Nornadoms. I have written the judgment of the Norns, but it probably could be better to write the verdict of the Norns. But this Viking Age presentation of Hel as a seductive lover is in sharp contrast to medieval Snorri's dark description, which must have been strongly influenced by Christian concepts. In an article on the subject by the Norwegian professor Gro Steinsland, several examples of skaldic poetry where Hel is described as an attractive maiden have been pointed out. In Thorbjørn Brunason's ransom song from the early 11th century, we find that Epli Heljar, that is Hel's apples, is a kenning for death. Hel's apples. And the kenning alludes, of course, to Idun's apples. And, as Steinsland reminds us, apples were also ancient symbols of lovemaking. Actually, I would say that apples are also ancient symbols of eternal life, immortality. They are associated with the Garden of Eden and with the Garden of the Nymphs, where these fruit of immortality are kept. But now, anyway, in the Edda poem Balders Draumar, or Vegtamskviða, that is the one where Odin goes down into Hel to seek the prophecies of a dead Völva. Well, here, Hel is presented as a hall, decorated and well furnished for a party, awaiting the arrival of Balder to the realm of death. This gives the image of a rich house Freyja's hall. That is, house Freyja was the word husfreyja. That was the lady of the house. But this gives the image of a rich house Freyja's hall, one who takes good care of her realm and has no trace of Snorri's tale of hunger and misery. Towards the end of the 900s, the Icelandic poet Tindur Hallkelsson described Hel as in death with the kenning, the bendable branches of Gerdr's shoulders. That is, as Gerdr's arms. You know, the Gerdr is the giantess who was married to Freyr, and her arms illuminated the world, and she lived in a place very much like the place that her place in the Skirnismal is described exactly as the Hall of Hel. And here, in this ancient pagan skaldic poem, death is referred to as the bendable branches of Gerdr's shoulders. That is, the bendable branches are the arms. The bendable branches of Gerdr's shoulders are the arms of Gerdr. And that's death in this poem. And Gerdr is here used as a metaphor or a cover name for Hel. Moreover, in the same stanza, Hel is preparing a bed for the earl who was fighting on the battlefield. In Norse poetry, the hint to a woman's arms is always a hint to the lover's embrace and has erotic overtones. With these examples from poetry, Steinsland pointed out that we have probably moved a step closer to genuine pagan Viking Age concepts of Hel as an erotically attractive entity, which makes it easier to grasp the image of death as a loving union between the dying and the mistress of the death realm. This seems to be connected to death on the battlefield or at sea. It is possible that the Valkyria who takes the dead to Valhall were part of the same motive, as the heroes of the Edda are often married to their valkyrier. In the Helgakvida Hunningsbana second, that is at the poem, Helgi's death is followed by the entry of his Valkyria into the grave and a reference to high goddesses being with the dead. I quote stanza 46. Nu bruder, byrgdar I haugi, lofta viser, jo oss lidnom. Now has the bride arrived in the burial mound. The high goddesses are with us dead ones. Another example that Steinsland gives is a strophe from the Viking Age skald Hofgardarefer Gestsson, where the idea of courageous death in battle is described as an act of vigorous lovemaking in the golden bed of the maiden. And I read, the generous Freyr god, that is the warrior, climbed the golden bed of the maiden. The warrior showed great virility. So he was really good at dying, basically. He died fighting. And that is actually described poetically as a metaphor for, but lovemaking is used as a metaphor for his death by fighting. I'm gonna read it in Old Norse. Jøfrir Åsfrøyr gekk I golli stokna, sæing meiar, hoars drifu asker vidrin throska. The generous Freyr god climbed the golden bed of the maiden. The warrior showed great virility. So this is, he died well. Basically, that's what it means. And he died. The moment of death is said when he climbs the golden bed of the maiden of Hel. And death on the sea can also be described as a sexual union between the dying and the 9 daughters of Ran. In Flatøyarbok, we hear that a crew that struggle to survive in a tempest are being tried seduced by the daughters of Ran. And it says, Ran's daughters tried the men, inviting them to their fiery embrace. Reinduranar döter, dreiningina och budu them sin fadmelog. Fadmelog, their fiery embrace. So they invited them to have sex with them, and that means that they invited them to death by drowning. In Fritjof's saga Hin Frækni, chapter 6, death is described as climbing the bed of Ran. It is said, now I shall soon climb the bed of Ran. That is, I am going to die soon. The expression of skaldic poetry to climb Ran's bed is the equivalent of losing life at sea. In Sonatarek, stanza 10, the poet Egil Skallagrimsson describes his grief after the death of his son, Bodvar. His life has been radically changed, and he described in poetry his son's death journey as walking the path of lust, or Moonvega, the path of lust. That was a description of his son's death. He walked the path, of lust. Since the 1990s, the Norwegian professor Gro Steinsland has published several studies on the myths of sacred marriage in Old Norse sources, and is one of the few scholars who has emphasized this connection between death and sex as a theme that goes beyond mere poetical imagery. The Old Norse poets associated the death of males with a sexual encounter, not just because it gave a thrilling poetical schwung, but because it was a concept deeply embedded within the Old Norse culture and religion, the pagan religion. Steinsland believes the connection between death and sexuality originated in the cult of sacred marriage, where the king ritually married the goddess of the land, of the ancestral mother of his people, which was often the same thing. The marriage is mythically conducted during a symbolic death or whilst in the underworld. Well, I believe that there could be more influences on this concept than the ritual of sacred marriage alone. I think that a very important backdrop to the combination of sex and death in poetry may simply be the fact that the realms of death are dominated by female rulers. After all, the sexual theme only happens when a man dies. The woman who imagined that she would sup with Freya after her death clearly also envisioned at least a banquet, but perhaps no sexual encounter or marriage is ever mentioned in connection to women's death. Odin may have achieved power in one of the afterlife spheres, Valhall, but even there, the actual choosers of the slain are the Valkyriur, and the power of resurrection derives from the mead that runs from the teats of the she-goat Heidrun, served by the Valkyriur. And Heidrun is subtly identified as Freya in the Hyndluljóð. It is Freya who ultimately chooses the slain and receives them into her hall, letting half of the chosen go to Odin. The heroic poetry clearly shows that Odin's influence in the choice of dead souls and their afterlife fate completely depends on his ability to control the Valkyriur or to control Freya. In the Norse world, death is personified and is always a female. At sea, it is not Aegir, the sea lord, but his wife Ran, who receives the drowned in her net. Her daughters, the waves, assist their mother by luring sailors to their death. The ladies of the ocean represent death by drowning. In the mountains, we have the Lady of the Rocks, and another female, perhaps Skadi, whose very name represents death by injury. Skadi. We still have that word here, skade. It means injury, and an injury that can often lead to death. And this is something that very often happens in the mountains. Hel, on the other hand, is death in general, and appears to have been associated with illness and old age by the time of Snorri, which is the 13th century, 200 years after paganism was outlawed. So the concept of Hel as a place for illness and old age is late. It's a way of connecting her to hell, bad afterlife. Because all earlier sources describe her realm as a very loving place, a sexy place anyway, party place. As Steinsland pointed out, actual Viking Age poetry, which is far older than Snorri's account, reaching back into the pagan age, appear to consider Hel an attractive female whose seductive power lures all kinds of males to all kinds of death. In the poem Solarljóð, the dying man is called on by the Helju Meyjar, the maidens of Hel. The dying men are often described as helpless playthings in the arms of the lustful death woman, although the courageous man of an honorable death would be described as vigorous and virile, one who showed ability to satisfy the goddess of death by being manly and taking control and all that. And that is supposedly a good death. Females dominate the afterlife realm, corresponding with the tendency in Old Norse law to associate feminine powers with the secret and hidden realms, and with fate, because the ultimate fate for all mortals is death. In the poem Solarljóð, death involves a 9-night trial in the seat of the Norns, the Nornarstolin, where the Norns would decree their judgment on the dead person. The judgment of the Norns, Nornardómur, is also mentioned in the poem Fafni's Mál, said to be something that will be received before one has crossed the river of death. As to the personal norms of the individual, there is ample evidence that a person's fylgur followers would arrive at a person's death, bidding the dying person home, that is, to their home. And most fylgur appear to have been, I wrote here, the souls of dead female ancestors. I wrote this many years ago, and I would probably have elaborated that claim a bit more because it's a bit too simple. But what we know is that it's apparent that the fylgur had as one of their afterlife tasks to help those who died to cross over. Sexual unions between shamans and spirits of the opposite sex abound in various shamanistic traditions, and the mysteries and other mythical and devotional religious traditions have emphasized a romantic relationship between the initiate and the deity, where the union between a soul and the divine is metaphorically described as a sexual encounter. In all these traditions, the union would happen during the initiation, whilst in the underworld. Such concepts may have found their way into the general perception of death as a place where the female ruler or rulers of that realm embraced the male newcomers, perhaps promoted by Viking Age poets who often described death as a sexual encounter. Now, when we don't find that many sources about women dying, it's because these poets described deaths of kings and deaths of warriors, basically. And these are the poems that we have that have been transmitted to us, the ones that sort of mattered, the poets, the poems of men who were poets at royal courts. That's why we probably don't hear that much about how women what they were supposed to experience when they died. And we don't really know if the poetical metaphor was just a poetical metaphor, or if it actually describes how people really thought. There is some reason to think that they describe how people really thought. It's just that we don't know exactly how they thought about women dying, or other people dying who were not kings and warriors, because the poetry that has been left to us, the parts of the poetry, the parts of the lore that came down to us, that was written down by medieval scholars who were into kings and warriors, and that's why we don't hear so much about the others. So in any case, the fact that female powers receive the dead is, in my opinion, the most important reason why Norse poets promoted sexual metaphors for death, but there may certainly be more to it than that. Sacred marriage is one influence, as Steinsland argued. I think that the myth of the Mead woman that I've worked on is another, which is not necessarily always about sacred marriage, but about the mysteries of initiation and resurrection, where the love of the Mead woman is essential for the successful return to life as a new, reborn initiate worthy of a sacred office. Knowledge about the metaphor of a sexual union for death will make it easier for us to understand the true role of the maiden with the mead and her loving embrace during initiation, as we discussed in chapter 3, for her embrace is death and possibly resurrection. Okay, that was chapter 7.3. Thank you.
Velkøypt slitar, hefi ek vel noti, fosser frodom vant. Tvi at Oderer nu uppkommen, og alda ves jardar. Baug eid Odin, hygg ek at unnit haf, at skall hans trygdom trua. Suttungsviken, han lät sum bli fra, och Greta Gunnlöd